right, let's go ahead and get started, I guess, since I think all the logistics are out of the way. So this is, in case you're in the wrong place, just want to make sure you know that this is about managing dual boot systems and troubleshooting. I'm not going to talk a whole bunch about actual individual client management systems to deploy, because that's more topics than time we have. But what I really want to talk about is understanding how it's supposed to work, how you're supposed to have it set up, what doesn't work, and how to troubleshoot it. Right? Because that's one of the things that kind of gets in your way for dual booting. How many people have dual boot labs? All right. How many people run XP? All right. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So I don't want to offend anybody. That's good. Oh, wait a minute. We got one hand. You run XP? No. Oh, you did. Okay. Please don't stretch when I ask you to raise your hand. It confuses me. So let's talk about WinClone. No, just kidding. We'll get to WinClone in a little bit, but it's not just about WinClone. My company produces WinClone, so that was supposed to be a joke. I'm Tim Perfitt, and just a little bit about me. You can follow me on Twitter at @tperfitt. It's pretty much the only social network I can stand these days. But I work for Two Canoes Software. I worked for Apple for 11 years, and then they let me go. They said, you did your time, you need to leave. No, I decided was to go out and people, I tried to kill WinClone for 2 years, and it refused to die because the community decided it was a decent tool. So I decided to give up with the whole Apple stuff and focus on WinClone, which is, at the time, people thought I was insane because why would you leave Apple to do a dual boot Windows utility on the Mac? But it's been received well. People are happy. In fact, somebody just stole the cream from me at my table and said, this is what you get for not taking care of WinClone for 2 years. So. And if that's all I have to pay for it, that's all right. I'm also a Return Peace Corps volunteer for what that's worth. And I was a Windows 2000 desktop administrator and NT40 server farm administrator during the .com era. So you can feel sorry for me if you want to. So most people are running dual boot already. Everyone has their own personal reasons and political reasons to do dual boot. The ones that kind of hit my heart is I'm seeing a lot of people do dual boot because they want a single hardware vendor, which to me is one of the most ironic things because I went through probably a decade and a half of people saying Apple's more expensive. If you only want to buy the commodity things to take care of it, now people are standardizing on Apple hardware because one, the PC hardware just doesn't run OS X, and two, people want that hardware, and three, it's not as expensive. It's the difference between prices is depending on how your negotiation skills can be negligible or it can be small. User choice, that's a big one that I hear a lot. People talk about allowing the users to choose, as well as the instructors, as well as IT, be able to have the flexibility. And it makes the labs look awesome. And that sounds like a joke, but I've actually been in multiple schools where it's actually they use the labs as a recruiting tool, right? You walk in, you have these really nice iMacs, you have these Mac Pros, whatever you have, and it really looks futuristic. And it also gives students a choice, and the impression it gives for the university is that this is all about giving students the tools they need to be able to get the education that they're looking for. Plus, it's the kind of the computing environment that they're kind of striving for to make it look. So we've actually had places where they will spend more money just because it looks better, not so much because it's necessarily they couldn't afford two different labs, but it makes some more sense to them and it looks great. But there are some challenges, as everyone in this room knows, for dual boot labs. The big one is image creation and deployment. The ultimate holy grail is to be able to take your IT groups, Windows images that have been probably out of Ghost, and deploy them on your Macs. Because they did all the work, they sysprepped them, they prepared them, they installed all the applications. And that can be a challenge because of the boot camp drivers and the specific stuff on the hardware. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to prepare your image and how to be able to deploy it. Patching and updating is a huge piece. One of the challenges for dual boot is that half your operating system, well, you have two operating systems, so half the time one's not running. So either you're not patching Windows or you're not patching OS X. And so that can be a huge headache and a big challenge. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Boot times is a funny one to me because I remember back in like 97 when when Windows 95 came out. Yeah, it was Windows 95. The boot time was better than the Mac. That's when it passed the boot time. You had a stock installed boot. You can boot up, and it caused a lot of hand wringing. It's like, oh my God, this PC boots up faster. And those boot times were in the minutes, right? Now you can boot, a Mac comes up in 30 seconds, right? I timed it 32 seconds, 33 seconds. And that's not a fresh install. It's after me working on it for a couple of years. And on the Windows side of things, with Windows 8, you have the restore times. It goes into this hibernation mode. It can come up very, very quickly. But it's still a big consideration. I know that some of your Windows images probably take 2 or 3 minutes because there's a lot of binding and negotiating. But it's a bit less of a concern it was, but it's still a huge issue because the instructor walks in, class had finished, they walk in, they want to start teaching right away, and if they have to wait for the machine to boot up, that's actually a killer for a dual boot lab. And so they don't want it to be on the Mac side and have to boot into Windows. So we'll talk a little bit about how people have gotten around that. User confusion, this is an interesting one I heard, is that if people walk into a dual boot lab and it's all Macs, they're like, oh, I don't want to use a Mac, I want to use a PC, and so they walk out. And so the Apple logo actually confuses people, and so there's some working around that. And this one, I think, is hilarious, the Windows keys, right? I don't know how to use this keyboard. This keyboard is confusing. And that's usually solved by putting, a lot of these problems are usually solved by making it worse for the Mac user because they're going to accept it, and the Windows user, it's like they know, so it's fine. So a lot of times they just swap in a Windows USB keyboard, and the problem goes away. Which I say, that's not fair, but they say, you know what, I'm an administrator, I want it to work, so we're done. So let's talk a little bit about preparation for your Windows image. So I'm going to skip over the whole, here's Boot Camp Assistant, here's how you install Windows on it. We'll talk a little bit about the details about how Windows actually gets installed and how the disk is configured. But this is assuming that you already know you run Boot Camp Assistant, you have a fancy new Mac that has no optical drive. You have to use the thumbstick to be able to put Windows onto it and boot up from that, which is actually a very slick way to go about it. But we're assuming that you already have Windows installed on your Mac, and you just have it on one machine. And now you want to look at being able to deploy this to massive amounts of machines. So the first thing you always want to do is sysprep the image. This is the only time you wouldn't want to have to sysprep the image is if all your hardware is identical. Sysprep strips out all of the driver discovery, so it has to rediscover all the drivers on it, and resets it to what Microsoft likes to call the out-of-box experience. So just like you're setting up a new PC to go through it. If you don't want to have the whole answer these questions, set the time zone, create a user account, you can create what's called an answer file. This is such a well-worn path, right? If you don't know about sysprep, I guarantee you there's somebody in a cubicle next to you or down the hall that has so much experience with sysprep they want to cry. Because this is what a Windows administrator lives in, right? It's the tool they use to really be able to get the drivers right, to get the machine set up. And so there's a lot of information out there about sysprep. On the Mac side, the two big challenges are antivirus. So sysprep works by, like I said, making it more the out-of-box experience, but when you boot it up, that's when it rediscovers everything. And if it can't discover everything correctly, it just craps out. And it stops there, it tells you to reboot, and it'll try again. Whenever you get the message that says reboot and try again, they're just lying to you. They're saying you're screwed, right? Your reboot is just going to do it again, and it's going to tell you to reboot and try again, and you're going to keep doing that with every time more hope and more hope. But at that point, you're pretty much stuck. So you want to make sure the sysprep process doesn't fail. And so antivirus is one of the big ones. If you uninstall antivirus beforehand, that does it. And this is my favorite one, is if you have the Windows Media Server service turned on, that'll screw up the sysprep process. So if you go into the Windows services and turn off the Windows Media Server service, which is on every Windows 7 and Windows 8 and maybe even earlier, turned on automatically, it can mess up. Not always, but sometimes. And the problem is if you're already down that path, you got to go back and start over. And you're only allowed to sysprep a machine. How many times are you allowed to? I don't actually know the right answer to this. 3, 4 times, is it? It's one of those counting things where I always hit it and I'm like, I can't remember how many times I've done it. But Microsoft limits you to running sysprep on a machine before you have to fully install again. And like everything else, there's registry hacks and those kind of things to get around it. But it's best to not have to do that kind of stuff. But anyway, sysprep will allow you to prepare the image, and then you can do some other fancy things like bind to Active Directory, set the computer name, run the updates, set it up to be able to run the updates on first boot. There's an awesome tool called Brigadier. That's specifically, it's a Python script that can be compiled, that can put on Windows, and it will go out and grab the latest version of the Boot Camp drivers. So Apple provides the Boot Camp drivers. They dropped support for Windows XP. They supported 64 and 32-bit versions of Windows, but they dropped the 32-bit support, so now all the drivers that are provided are the 64-bit versions for Windows 7 and Windows 8. And that's kind of the direction going forward. And the problem is that when you get new hardware, there might be new drivers, and so there's almost always two sets of Boot Camp drivers that are available from Apple. And finding the right ones for your specific hardware can be a challenge. So Brigadier goes and discovers that, and then we'll install those drivers. It's an open, I have a link to it at the end of the resources, but it allows you to basically drop this binary in, and at first login, it goes and discovers all the Boot Camp drivers, and all of a sudden your screen resolution changes, your mouse starts to work, and everything kind of is wonderful. It doesn't do anything magic, it doesn't install the drivers ahead of time, it doesn't do anything you couldn't do by just manually installing it, but it automates the process, which is a fun thing. Anybody use Brigadier? Everybody maybe have experience with it? Has been.
Well, what I'm trying to figure out how to do with it is integrated with my studio environment, so like extracted to a second partition and my system will run that on first boot.
Yeah, the big challenge for me is that it runs it on first login, not first boot, so you actually have to log in as a user. So there is some touch and go. It's better if you have it and you give it to somebody to start it up versus a lab kind of situation. Yep.
Now in your situation, have you compose answer files?
Yes and no. It depends on the individual circumstance. If you're migrating an individual machine, which is what I do a lot, you don't have to do the answer file because you can sit in front of it. But if you're doing any kind of mass deployment, you're going to want an answer file because otherwise you have to go through and individually set up the machines, go through the setup system. Have you done some of that, or are you?
I myself haven't put out Windows code.
Yeah, it's for me, it's an interesting experience when you get in front of this. You're like, you know, on OS 10 I'm great, and you put it into Windows, and I know enough to be dangerous, and I do stuff, and you give it to a Windows administrator, it's flipped, right? They know all these tools where all the bodies are hidden, and you need to change this registry entry before you run this, and it's like when they sit in front of a Mac, they're like, what is this terminal thing you speak of? But then when they get onto it, and it's in Windows, they can set up your answer file and do all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of black magic involved in the answer file, too. And by black magic, I mean just historical cruft or knowledge that's gained over the centuries. So definitely check out Brigadier. It definitely makes life easier. For me, it's more for the individual when you're handing it out, but we're looking at ways to be able to automate that process in lab, like you said, in the Play Studio. Yeah, Mike?
Can you still process for logging once or twice as a user?
Oh, okay.
That's how I do.
Oh, it is. Okay. That I didn't know.
That's what works. The biggest problem for me is having the network drivers installed and then I figure out how to do it. The network drivers, some of them use well, you just download all of them from scratch. All of them, put them on one folder. That would have been an advantage. That's the one thing that we use. Is all the network drivers so that can do that you want.
Okay. Yep. So you need to have. So basically, the comment is you need to have network connectivity before you can run Brigadier because it does go to the internet to download them, and so you have to bake the Ethernet drivers or the network drivers, I guess, into the machine. Yeah, right. Because there's not a lot of Ethernet ports left on Macs these days. And then, of course, the Boot Camp drivers, which I talked about a little bit, Apple provides. It's actually a wonderful. I mean, it's like I actually just bought. I should have brought my Asus in here. I went into Tiger. We have a Tiger Direct. Factory outlet store near ours, right? And so it's like a discount Fry's, which is saying something, right? So you go in there, and I bought a $379 Asus laptop, which was like a 17-inch display. I mean, it was an amazing amount of crap technology for very little money, and I had to install the drivers on it because whatever reason. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It wasn't that machine. It was I'm plugging that one was set up. It was an older Dell machine. And I wiped it, put Windows 7 on it. Then I installed the Windows 7 drivers. And I'm like, okay, where's the package to do that? And it's like Dell's site like laughed at me, right? Because it's like, here's the individual drivers you want. And there was like 15 of them. And you have to individually download them after downloading the download manager. So it's like one of these things. I spent, before the 300 software updates, a good couple hours just installing the drivers onto it. And so, yes, their bootcamp driver is kind of a pain in the butt, but it's all in one place and it's a package you can install, right? So Apple's put them all together, which is very nice. And so it's, for me, it was the actually having to download them individually. And one of the guys that works in my office is a PC administrator, and I'm like, no, I want the package. This can't be how people do it. He's like, Tim, you need to get over that, and just started downloading these and individually installing them. Am I right? Is there like some magic hardware detecting?
In Dell, you can do this.
I do, the service number. He's like, flip it open, you put in the service tag, and you go to the same page with the 16 drivers.
Some manufacturers now have.
Okay. All right. Because I want to go find Michael Dell in his dorm room and say, do something better. And it might just be my heart, because when I was the NT administrator, we used all Dell, so it's probably because of those days that made me so bitter. For deployment, so the ways, once you have this image created, so you sysprep the image, now you want to get it from this one machine, and you want to be able to push it out to a bunch of different machines. And there's lots of options to be able to do that. We create WinClone, and for a lot of these different tools, so there's some open source tools that allow you to do it. You can use Gparted, you can use Linux. But for the sane administrator, using either Deploy Studio's built-in tools to be able to create an image of your bootcamp partition, or using WinClone with one of the other ones, including with Deploy Studio. And Deploy Studio, to just do a dual boot deployment, or just a Windows deployment on Macs, it can be daunting for the first-time person to set up Deploy Studio. So if WinClone will work with just a FireWire drive or USB drive, that's not a FireWire going on, USB drive, you can walk around and install it that way. But more on a massive scale, you're either going to be using WinClone with one of these other tools, or just using Deploy Studio's built-in stuff. How many people are using Deploy Studio? Everybody, okay? Built-in tools, how many people are using the built-in tools? WinClone? Okay. So it's a kind of a mix between them. JAMF supports WinClone as kind of the tool that they recommend to just create a WinClone image. They actually have a lot of stuff baked in to automatically push it out. They don't use WinClone's built-in tools. And ARD. I heard a lot of people talk not so nicely about ARD, but how many people have ARD on their machines? Yeah, we'll see there you go. That's how pervasive it is. How many people have machines that disappear and reappear just magically? Okay, there you go. And pretty much any other client management software that can run a script, right? Because if you can go ahead, there's a self-extracting script within WinClone that allows you to expand it out. So as long as you're able to run, if you can deploy a file and run a script, which to me is a definition of what a client management software has to do as one of the features, then they can deploy a dual boot image. Does anybody use anything else besides this? Capture. Since everybody's using Deploy Studio, that's probably the first one. All right. So some of the deployment challenges. What we found of a lot of people as they're deploying these things, Deploy Studio, whatever, when you repartition the drives, the built-in tools Apple provides, almost always the drive numbers strongly or exactly correlate to what device it's installed on. So almost always your built-in disk is /dev/disk0. The first slice is your EFI partition, so /dev/disk0 slice 1 is the EFI partition, which all EFI drives have on it. The slice 2 is almost always your Mac hard drive, slice 3 is your recovery partition, and then you put Windows on slice 4. So depending on how your system's set up, and you have to repartition it, those numbers can get jumbled up until you reboot. And so what happens is you end up trying to install, and one of the problems you have is that Windows requires to know what partition it's on when it's booting up. So you'll get this wonderful can't find OS or the blue screen when you start up because it thinks it's starting up from partition 3, it's actually starting up for partition 4. Actually, in this case, it thinks it's starting up for partition 5, it's actually starting up for partition 4. And so one of the wonderful things is people will spend a couple hours trying to get this to work, angrily sending emails to our support. Oh, doesn't this work? And you know what the answer is to tell them to do? Reboot. right? Because once you reboot, the numbers will all come out fine and it works great. And so, it's one of those experiences where half of you feels relieved and the other half feels angry that why didn't I just know that ahead of time and why do I have to do this? So one of the things is if you get in that situation where remote booting, and I'll show you on the command line some of the ways to be able to kind of look and see how these things get jumbled up. Image sizes, these are not trivial sizes. Okay, we'll play who has the largest Windows image. I've made one that's 30 gigs. Anybody larger? 80? We got 80? 80 wins. What's the largest thing on what makes it 80?
That's for talk about it as like CAD software.
Okay. Okay, Nate's got something bigger.
Okay, I can do one.
Oh, 120 gigs. Okay. So you're taking, what was 5 minutes to play that image or so? You did it over wireless, and it was about 5 minutes. Is that what happened? So image sizes, I'm being snarky a bit, but obviously image sizes are a big deal because these are large ones. There's ways you can go about it. You can bake the image inside as kind of a post-install script that's baked inside your OS X image. Well, the nice thing about that is if it's hidden inside, then you can use some of the multicast stuff to be able to deploy the images. You can do it separately and set up the image. What's nice about that is you can have being able to update the different sides at different times, so you don't have to tie it to your OS X deployment. So image size is one of the huge challenges. And hardware differences. I touched on this a little bit when we talked about Brigadier, but just having different Macs, having different hardware on it, it's not as stark as the Windows environment because Apple has a lot less hardware. They keep their product line relatively small, and so you don't have the big differences, but you will have different drivers or different devices even within the same models occasionally. And so the thing is, don't make that assumption. Oh, we bought all iMacs for this one lab. We don't have to worry. You can use that same image, not sysprep it, because it works great today. It's going to work great tomorrow. That's not really the case. It cannot be the case because you might have a logic board replaced, or there might be a new iMac that gets replaced only on the instructor's machine. So hardware differences can play a big role into making sure it can be a challenge when deploying it. All right, so now user selection. Now we got the image onto these machines, and we want to look at the user selection to be able to choose which OS to boot into. The most common way, the easiest way, built into OS X, which I didn't put up on the slide, is doing what? Option key, right? That's intuitive, right? You don't have to tell the instructors or tell the students about it. That's usually the first day you have the orientation, you say, hold down the option key. What's the problem with the option key? Besides it being obscure. Windows keyboards, that's true. I still can't do it on a Windows keyboard. What's that? Right. If they hold the option key down, what can they do? They could do everything, right? Because if it only shows one other volume, they can plug in a USB drive. Yeah.
Also, if you have your EFI firmware password placed,
there you go.
Your host.
And what happens when you hold the option key down and you have the EFI firmware?
It's a little lock.
Yeah, you get the little lock. So the way you solve that is by telling them the firmware password, right? Problem solved.
Actually, I put it on a big poster.
I usually have sticky notes, right? So that's one of the big problems with the option key is that you can have a firmware password. And as soon as you don't have a firmware password, and you say, well, they're not administrators, does not matter, right? Because I can go into single user mode and reset your password in 30 seconds, right? The only thing around that is if you did full disk encryption or something like that. And now we're just getting crazy, right? Because this firmware password is really the way you want to do this, to be able to do that. So you really don't want something that relies on the built-in boot picker because it requires you not to have a firmware password, or you can also go into system preferences and choose that. But then what do you have to do? If you go into the startup disk system preference pane, you got to be admin, or you can talk to Sam and you can hack the etc authorization file. But either way, it's not probably the happiest way to go about it. So most people go with some kind of boot picker in their labs. Refit has gone away. Somebody revived it as Refind. I think I get the capitalization there. I apologize. Oh, no, that's right, I think. Refind. And then it boots everything. There's not been anything I've thrown at it that it doesn't boot. And you have crazy Windows or Linux installs with multiple partitions everywhere, and it will boot it. It's focused on EFI, so if it's an EFI booter, it'll do it. It actually does a lot of the master boot record stuff too as well. But there's some issues with refit and refind, and mainly for me, it's the UI looks like crap. So it looks like you've somehow fallen into a X11 1999 type interface. But the advantage of it, it does work. The other disadvantage is you're not on the network. Yeah.
Well, that also you have no screensaver, no thermal control.
Right. So you're not basically the machine's not booted up. You have none of the niceties of a booted machine. You're sitting in firmware. So if you have an individual machine and you're holding down the option key, refit works great or refine works great. But if you want to be able to do any management or any kind of the screensaver / fan control and that kind of stuff, it doesn't work.
It's supposed to be unburnable. We've seen them burn on.
I've actually seen it for other reasons too. I don't know who started this rumor that LCDs don't burn, but I think what it is, if you leave them sit for like a week, they'll correct themselves. Versus CRTs wouldn't do that. But how many people are using refit? Anybody want to share experiences with how do you use refit? And
Just a dual boot lab I have, so at the time I'm shut down after 5 minutes, don't select.
oh, I see. So they boot up to it, goes into the.
Boot up, it goes into it, and shut down is the default selection with 5 minutes.
Okay. I also heard that refit doesn't allow you to. Oh no, it's like never mind. That doesn't make sense because it doesn't allow you to reboot, but you would be booting into it. So that makes sense. You said you had a use refit as well. How do you use it? So you leave it sitting on all the time for them? Okay. There's also Boot Picker, which dead. This is the tool that has an interesting history behind it. It was originally developed as a project by a large fruit company externally and made available for free, and then it wasn't. And you can still find it on the European side of Apple's education site, I believe. But if you can only find a tool on the European education site, you kind of know where it's going, right? The tea leaves are in the bottom of the cup.
I found it, but I couldn't get it.
Oh, really?
I had to think about it, but I couldn't bring it in.
Right. And so there is some people still using Boot Picker. I'm looking at you, Mike. And it is not being updated. It is not being promoted actively. It's going to get harder and harder as you go forward. Mike has found some ways around it to be able to get it work on 10.8. Is that right? But it's not necessarily something that's going to be actively updated. Because I don't believe the source code's even available for it. I think you got to just hack the configuration. Unless you know somebody.
I know what 10.7 will bring with crap. It worked 80% of the time.
Okay.
We've been very fortunate.
It worked just fine.
Okay. So it definitely was it was a great free tool to be able to do that. But I can't, you got to move past it at this point, find something else because it's not actively being done. There is some other options. Refit's the first one. We produce a product that's paid called Boot Runner. That's worth a check out. There's some other open source products that help you do that. Scuba's one that started up. There's been a couple others that started up. They're all based off of this one magic command called bless, and there's a next boot only flag. And the next only flag, what it does is it says boot into this other OS just the next time. All right? So it's not, the technology behind it is not that hard. The real problem behind it is getting something that works kind of consistently and kind of allows the user to be able to understand what's going on in terms of selecting the OS. But marking the disk itself is not all that hard. All right, so let's talk about boot times. One of the things I said about the keyboard is you can't, the solution was make to the Mac users suffer a little bit because they're going to accept it more for some reason. They're more accepting at pain, I guess. You give them hair shirts, they're fine with it. It's all good. So one of the solutions is for boot time is to make the Mac users wait. And so you can have it boot into Windows, and then you tell people if you want to they want to use the Mac, they reboot the machine and then select Mac. Which to me, I didn't want to necessarily recommend that, but it was an option, right? Because it depends on your population. If it's majority Windows, instructors in the instructor station, and the few ones that use Mac can do that. If you have more majority Mac users, you probably want something different than that. And the problem really this comes down to is that some of the Windows images I've heard you can actually have 8 to 10 minutes before the machine really becomes usable. And that is problematic if an instructor comes in 5 minutes beforehand and has a 45 or 50-minute class, right? They can cut into that time. Anybody have any experience on Windows booting times that they've, when it gets up and it's where it's stable, how long is the amount of time?
We've seen it use as long.
Okay.
I don't know how many other folks in the room use desktop authority. Desktop authority, which is it's a client management package. It's not optimized for Tether, so it works really well when it's big and then it's
Okay. Okay. That's been my experiences, but I don't bind to AD and do antivirus and all that kind of stuff. Are you guys bound to AD as well? Oh, it does. Okay. Oh, but I mean, if I cold start it, even when I get to the login screen and log in, people complain how it's still like, it feels like molasses until it's kind of, all the services are up and running. And does that still very quickly? Oh, okay. So it's weird. You got this like dichotomy, right? Some people take a long time. What was the one you said? It was Desktop Assistant? Is that right?
Desktop Authority.
Desktop Authority.
People call it script logic a lot. I mean, it's basically a GPO on steroids.
Okay. So it's doing a lot of synchronization or something like that in the background?
It's like setting what your printers are and setting what your shares are and all that. We're getting rid of it.
Okay. So if your boot times are really long, I should tell people to investigate and figure out why, because it shouldn't be that long.
No, but I mean, if you put a lot of middleware in there.
Yeah. Okay. 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 So it's not the network that's the limiting factor. It's really the spinning platters that are. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
You guys saw some buzzwords spotlight index early. Spotlight index Friday night. So we're like, yeah, it's up there.
Bug report on Amazon.com.
It was awful. So you're not into it as a student. Login time just go back. Something wrong. You know, no problem. I'm aware of it. However, it doesn't actually help you. Login for 7 years. So you probably agree with the interesting content amount of after medical. This is not. And so you get to go to talking about what
Yep.
Oh, minutes ago you said something about waiting for Windows to be stable and that had me baffled. That would never happen.
Nice. I guess what I meant is you make the time, but yeah. I'm actually it's funny from a dual boot standpoint and strictly sysprep and taking the whole UI and magic pane thing out of it. Windows 8. Windows 8 is a lot in terms of just disk check and sysprep. It used to take a long time. It kind of got longer each version of Windows. With Windows 8, it's almost instantaneous. So they've either done something like they've just stripped out to doing anything, or they've optimized it to do something, but it just seems to go incredibly fast. So we do a lot of QA with sysprep stuff, and it just now with Windows 8, it's a lot faster. Not sure what my feelings are about these live tiles, but sysprep's great. So in order to do this, it's interesting that there is it sounds like there can be delays on both sides. The real solution to this is figure out why. So you really should be expecting a minute and a half. If you want to get faster than a minute and a half, you really got to decide who's going to win, who's going to lose. You either got to keep one side heated up or the other side. In order to do that, you got to figure out which one's the majority usage of it. That's what it's talking about, scheduling OS boots. And Windows 8 boots a lot faster. Yep.
We have our Mac side scheduled to power on sometimes today. And the Windows side has the videos that will power those on. Makes it a fight, and they don't, sometimes machines don't wake up or boot up.
Okay. So you're saying you boot into, oh, you mean in order for the schedule, you're talking about Energy Manager where it's supposed to wake up? It doesn't wake up on a schedule.
Windows and the Mac side, depending on what it was booted in the last time it's been used, you may or may not boot up correct time or boot up a storage.
Oh, you're talking about it's completely shut down. You say schedule it to start up, so it's the Power Manager that's doing it.
The Windows and the Mac use different time.
I don't think that. No, that's all universal time. I would try doing the reset of the Power Management Unit. Did you try that? Because all the times
see what you're talking about.
Okay.
Not for the rebooting, but just like
you're not talking about rebooting though. You're talking about actually booting up, right? They completely turn off, and then you have a schedule to turn on. Okay.
I've seen it where the time is handled differently on both and different settings to DRAM. And so it doesn't. It's not going to. It may not be powered up for you because it doesn't think it's the time you want it to. Right.
I will say an argument.
That's his way. Oh, okay. Yep.
An argument that allows you to always have trouble with the managed, power management settings to turn off at like 1 and 1 at night and turn on at 7 in the morning. But Google Labs always have the little strategy machines that they don't follow the settings. So whatever the group comes, I think you
Interesting. Yes.
The issue there is that you have to shut down on the Mac side because it's only written out for power management unit or to wake it up from the Mac side. So if you shut it down on Windows,
And it comes to wake up on schedule.
it'll never.
It's like Windows clear.
Well, I think it's only like the power manager only has the ability to like wake it up once. There's no scheduling facility in the power manager. The scheduling facility in OSX and the EOS file. So
So I think written every time you shut down I think that was stored in the power management, but it doesn't seem like it works.
Go up. Okay, go up.
Yeah, please do.
How many folks have seen systems rebooted in Windows, root from Windows and root from Mac, and that's something that's doing more?
Windows handle time.
Right.
And so, if Windows actually supported UFI forever, or at least the Apple version by that, it would be wrong.
But how do, I mean, I've seen it, I know what it is, but how do folks fix it? We fix it by script.
well, it's the registry. In Windows, it's called Windows. The hardware clock is in UPC.
Okay.
Versus wall time, which is local time, which is like Windows expects.
We try to both ways. We try to put the registry and we try to put the update.
Cool. I wasn't aware of that issue. That's interesting. Yep.
Sorry, what was the solution? I didn't get it.
So the solution was there's a couple different solutions. One is to be able to set the Windows side, there's a registry hack or registry entry that say use the different time, the other time. It's not universal time. There's an epoch difference or something like that, right? What's the start point it starts from, right? Or is it no, it's the offset, right? It's the offset. Yeah, it's the offset.
Stored in the UPC on Mac hardware, or PC hardware, stored in the local time.
Okay. So you can do that. I actually have seen articles that say don't do that because it messes other things up. I'm not sure what they are. My memory's failing.
If you have that set, it'll never, if you sync with like the time sync with Active Directory or anything, you'll never be able to update the hardware clock. If you have a tool lab that spends 99% of its time in Windows, after a while, time will get out of sync and you have a policy that doesn't
Okay. And the other way to fix it is to go into the Mac side and shut down from the Mac side. Then that will always work. I don't know if that's appropriate.
The third way is just to put a login script that just has to ping the time server a couple times and reboot again. That's what we've done.
On the Mac side or on the PC side?
On the Mac side when you start.
But then if you go into the Windows side and shut down, it still wouldn't have. Why wouldn't it happen then?
Because it seems like we let the PC side kind of do its thing, and then let the Mac side do the correct.
But you still would be booting to the Mac to shut down before that would correct it, right? Okay. So there's and why it's random and it doesn't happen all the time. Did we figure that out or not?
I think it's to do with the last keys on that machine. If they work in Windows and shut down, or if they didn't shut down off their Mac.
Oh, I see. So the idea is to always shut down from the Mac. So when you shut down at 2 a.m., reboot into a Mac side and shut down, and then your problems go away?
You can't show the last person on that system, right? You reboot into Mac and then shut down the Mac.
Right. Unless you reboot them first and you know it's going to go with the next only into the Mac side, then you shut them down. I mean, you could do something like that. I'm not saying
Windows image to make the shutdown go away. So
Okay.
When you reboot.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
So then you were always back and we're using boot trigger, and I think we're going to be moving to your product.
Okay.
But that was how we.
Same thing, right? Because then you're in the Mac side of things and you can shut down from there.
Correct.
There's a question over here?
I was just going to say the same thing. You just remove the ability to shut down.
Right. Okay. That's good. All right, so let's talk about the Windows boot process, because in order to troubleshoot these issues, you've got to kind of understand how Windows boots up. And this is the legacy boot process. It's not the EFI boot process, which is different. So this is how Windows looks on a master boot record type formatted disk. So when Windows first starts up, it looks at there's a boot sector at the very front of the disk. First 512 or 443 bytes at the disk. And it has bootstrap code. And this bootstrap code is the one that has the wonderful, please insert a disk or can't boot OS. That little text message is actually in there. But it's only very few bytes, so it can just start up, right? And from there, it looks at what the flag partition is. So you have 4 partitions in the master boot record, and they have what's called a flag. And you can flag which one you want. On the Mac, when you're booting Windows, Windows has to be the last of the first 4. And we'll talk about that in a little second, but really what the code in the master boot record looks for is what's flagged. And usually that's going to be 4. It gets 4 flagged. At that point, it hands off to the volume boot record. So on the beginning of the 4th partition, or whatever partition you have, but in this case, this example would be the 4th, it starts running that boot code, right? And at that point, it hands it off to boot manager, which is an actual .exe or an executable Windows file. And at that point, it looks to the Windows BCD file on disk to figure out the boot settings, what does the cool graphics look like, and what partition, again, is it booting from. And at that point, it boots up. So that's what happens when everything works right. Okay, this is from cold boot, and so if anything goes wrong here, you're done, right? It doesn't boot. If it fails at the master boot record, the important thing is the error message. If it fails at that first step, you get the black screen with the flashing cursor. Right? That wonderful just flashing cursor up there and nothing happens. You also get the can't find operating system or please insert a CD or whatever, depending on what version of the bootstrap code you have. Once you hit the volume boot record and you're booting up, if the boot manager starts to fail, what do you think you get? Well, even more dramatic, blue screen. Right? You get a blue screen. A lot of times it'll automatically restart, so the blue screen will only happen for a half a second. It'll reboot and go through the same process again. So the important thing for that is to realize where it's failing. And so if you get if it's down here, you know there's a problem with your Windows install, right? If it's up there, it's something to do with how the disk was originally written down. Or it could be as simple as you just have the black screen with a flashing cursor. It could be as simple as you don't have the right partition flag. And so it can be turned from something that's completely dramatic and doesn't work at all to that was easy to fix. It just boots up. And I'll talk about that in a second. I saw a hand. There was a question. Did you? No? Never mind. So that was about how to boot Windows 7 and Windows 8. Let's talk about XP, because there are some XPs out there. If XP's dead, get over it. I realize you might have some legacy applications, but look here. Really, if you go to Wikipedia, initial release was in October 25th, 2001, 11 years ago, as the time I made this slide. Think back what you were doing 11 years ago. you're probably in line waiting to get Windows XP to install it. No, that's probably not. That's a long time for an OS. It's getting increasingly harder. I asked people that are using XP. No, did anybody say, is there anyone here that's using XP? Nobody. Okay, not in the labs. Okay, good. I still get lots of requests for, like, people complain that it doesn't support Windows XP because there's that one application that would cost them $6 to upgrade. and sometimes they're not available anymore. But at this point, it's just getting ridiculous, right? It's been 11 years on. And we're not telling people to go to Vista anymore. We're telling them to go Windows 7, which is a lot better, or 8. So the challenges on the Mac side to be able to do it, I touched on this a little bit in the bootcamp session on Tuesday, but the 3 terabyte drives, specifically the iMacs, I believe the iMacs are the only ones that can have, I know they're the only ones that can have the 3 terabyte Fusion drives. And I don't know if can you order a Mac Pro with the 3 terabyte drive. But anyways, the majority population out there, people getting 3 terabyte drives, are special order or build order iMacs. And if you're a lab manager and you have a little bit extra money at the end of the year, because who doesn't? Let's go with the 3 terabyte drive iMacs because they're better, because there's more space, right? Who wouldn't want more? Because better, faster, higher quality. We all want those. So you order a bunch of 3 terabyte iMacs, and why not add the Fusion on as well? Because then you get the SSD, and you actually have speed as well as huge amounts of storage. But there's some challenges to that, which we'll talk about in terms of a dual boot lab. Has anybody done that and had issues? Yeah, so it's starting to hit people. Those are the people that have money at the end of the year. And multiple drives where they don't belong. Anybody know what I mean to that? Give me a hint. Yes. Drives in the optical bay because, gosh darn it, if you can install it, it must be supported. And why wouldn't it work? And on my PC, I can put a second drive in this other slot. So if there's a connector, it works. And so Apple doesn't QA for stuff put in the optical drive as a bootable Windows disk, right? That's not part of their QA process. And I don't even think they consider it if it doesn't work, they probably say don't do that. Put it in some other one. So you get a lot of people that have, if you have an optical drive in your MacBook Pro, you can pull out the optical drive and put in an SSD. You can put in just a 2.5-inch drive. If you have a Mac Mini, you can drop it. There's an extra slot in there. You can buy little kits from Outer World Computing. Is that right? That has a little chassis that you can install it. It works awesome on the Mac side, right? Totally works great. Dual booting doesn't work so well. And there's a difference between does it work consistently and does it work, right? You can put it in there and it works, or maybe it doesn't work. But if it doesn't work consistently, I don't want anything to do with it because I want my machine to boot consistently. And the solution is really easy. You just flop it. You put in the, if you want to use your optical drive, just put the one that's running boot camp in the bay 0, the main bay, and put the one that you want to run Mac OS on in the second bay. But that causes problems with booting, and we'll talk about 3 terabyte in a second. And the partition configuration, that's one of the big ones. This is Windows. I mentioned this before. Windows has to be the last of the first 4 partitions. And many times people have come at me and they've said, but I've set it up and it works fine. Right? You can only have one version of Windows installed at once, and it has to be the last of the first 4 for it to boot consistently. Does that mean it won't ever boot? No. It will sometimes boot. And you can get 2 versions of Windows running on your machine. But as soon as you make some kind of change to it, one of them will stop booting. And it'll be at the worst possible time. So that's what Apple supports with Boot Camp. If you can try to go outside of that, but it gets really flaky very quickly when you do. So let's talk about the first 4 partitions. This is the standard disk utility list output. The first one is just disk 0. It tells you that this one is GPT formatted. And OS X will boot from an F disk formatted volume. It just won't work very well with Boot Camp. So you really want to see the good partition table in that first line. The first one, the first slice, is the EFI partition. This EFI partition is just a partition that's required by the EFI spec, in order to make modifications to EFI in the future. Most of the time, if you're a big fan of DD like myself, if you do a DD on that EFI partition, it's going to be L0s. It's basically an empty partition at this point. The next one is the standard configuration is the Macintosh hard drive. This is your main OS 10 partition. You can see mine's 221 gigabytes. And then the recovery partition. And then finally the Windows one. So this is a very standard one. If you run Boot Camp Assistant, you set it up, this is what you're going to get. You can mess around with it. There's a lot of people, especially the people that come from the Unix background or have read a blog post that said you should always put your OS on a different partition than your data partition. They'll want to start inserting partitions here. And it gets problematic when the Windows booting. EFI supports a crazy number of bootable partitions, or of partitions. You can boot on any partitions. When you're doing the Windows stuff, you're limited. The Microsoft one, or the Microsoft data one, has to be the last of the first four. So I'm a big fan of getting it to be where it's in a state that Apple expects it to be, because then tools work going forward. This whole discussion about getting rid of the recovery partition and moving the recovery partition to different places, to me is a losing battle, because a lot of the Apple tools put it back, expect it, and there's only going to be more requirements for the recovery partition. So even though you don't use it and you don't want it, I would keep it there, and just because it'll keep sanity later on. Is that the consensus for the recovery partition? Is anybody getting rid of the recovery partition because they hate it so? Why is this?
Removable, like, I guess you could hide it, like, when you see into the macro right now, you could do that, it's
I myself would just, if I didn't want it, I would just erase it. I would still leave it there on the partition table, just because I've run a software update and the thing comes back. It's like this magic partition that will just occasionally reappear. Other people? Yeah. Oh. Okay. And the recovery partition, I think that was mentioned in the session yesterday, that a lot of things depend on it. I think it's when you do a password recovery, Find My Mac, a bunch of different things that Apple requires, and you're going to end up getting the GUI tools giving errors, because there's a lot of expectation that that's there now, and that's only going to get more going forward. All right, so now it's time for the dual boot quiz show. All right, so this rule that I said seems simple. On the first four partition, Windows has to be the last one. All right, this causes all sorts of problems with booting, so if you don't get this right, you're going to have a nightmare. So this one is called Will It Boot? Will this boot? First one's EFI. It's always going to be EFI. I'll give that one to you. Then the Mac hard drive, recovery partition, and Windows. Will Windows boot? Yes, it will. Windows last first four. So now you want to move Windows around because you want to have your extra Mac. So you get rid of this darn recovery partition, because I can't believe Apple's stealing 600 megabytes of my 3 terabyte drive, because that's horrible. I put Windows in the third partition. Will it boot? No, because it won't boot reliably. So now we have Windows as the first partition, because it's first, it should be able to boot, right? No, you can't do it. It's not a first of the fourth. A first of the first four. So you have EFI, Mac hard drive, recovery partition, Windows, and the Mac hard drive. Will it boot? Yes, it will, because Windows doesn't see anything outside the first four. So they do it. If I made that fifth one a FAT32 to share information with Windows, would that work? Yes, unless you're outside the 2.2 terabyte limit. I'll talk about that in a second. So now we got to the point. So you have your partitions in the right place. And if you mess around with the partition table and you don't follow the Windows must be last of the first four, it might work on one machine, it might not work on other ones, depending on how stuff is discovered when you're booting up. So you want to get that as the first one. The recovery partition actually helps in the sense that almost always the Windows partition is going to be the last one, the fourth one. Before you had kind of the option, you had this extra space, and people would add a Macintosh hard drive after the Windows one. That's usually not all that common anymore because of the recovery partition. So what Apple does to make Windows bootable, this is actually a really interesting way when this whole, I don't know if people remember the whole contest that happened to get Windows to boot on the Intel Macs. So this is an awesome, and it was up to like $50,000 and somebody won it, and then Apple like a week later came out with Boot Camp, which they just kind of had tucked away. Didn't know if they wanted to release it, but then when that stuff started happening, I don't know the politics behind it, but it was an exciting time in the Macintosh community for dual booting. So the way that they did it, the GPT spec says that there is a master boot record on all GPT disks. But no matter what your partition table is, you might have 50 partitions, the master boot record should say that you have one partition that spans the entire disk, right? And it should be an unknown partition type. And the reason for that was that if you had these newfangled GPT disks and you put it into a Linux machine or into a Windows machine, you didn't want to have the Windows machine to see it, or this machine to see it as unallocated space, right? Because if you saw it unallocated space, people would be like, oh, I'm not using that, and all your kids' photos would disappear. So what they did is they put this bumper one, because who's not going to recognize a master boot record partition table? So Windows would boot up, or Linux, or whatever, even an old Mac would boot up, and they'd look at it and they'd say, oh, this is just a partition I don't know. So put a big question mark, how to do it. So what Apple said is, well, you're not really using this master boot record for any kind of booting or anything like that. It's just a bumper. It's just to show that this is used. So let's go ahead and manipulate that a bit so Windows thinks it's actually a valid master boot record partition. So instead of having, I have a slide for this. Let me, I think I have one. No, that's what it is. But anyway, so this, it's the, so what it did is it takes this bumper one that's supposed to say you just have one partition that covers the whole disk that's not being used. It's just for legacy tools that aren't EFI, GPT aware, and make it so it looks like it's unknown. But Apple used it to specify which ones are booting. So that's why when you run, has anybody run fdisk and it says that it's a suspect master boot record partition table, that always comes up and it scares people the first time they see it. It's like, oh my gosh, my disk is corrupt. It's because this hybrid partition is not what it's expecting. All right, so the boot camp requirements, there is another requirement on top of the first 4 partitions. And this didn't matter back in the day when 1 gigabyte was a big deal. Right? Now that we're up to terabytes, the number of bits that's allocated in the master boot record that tell it what the largest thing it can reference on the drive is, the maximum is 2.2 terabytes. So it can't actually address anything past that. So Windows gets really crabby if you have any of your Windows partition past the 2.2 terabyte boundary. And you can see what this is if you go into Windows. And so what I did is I have a 3 terabyte Mac, and I've installed Windows on it. And you can see that it sees the EFI, this is a 200 megabyte EFI bumper, and then there's a primary partition that's, I believe this is, what do I have? That's the Mac partition. And then you have the NTFS Windows partition, the last one. This is the recovery partition. And then you have the unallocated ones. Those aren't unallocated. That's my Mac hard drive. But Windows can't see it. You notice there's the black bars above it? I can't even format this. As somebody that doesn't like to waste space, I'm going to right-click on this and say format it. It's going to give it a drive letter. You can't do that in the Windows tools because it can't read past that 2.2 terabyte. That doesn't mean Windows can't. If you're on a GPT, or if it's booted up in EFI, it could reference, I think, whatever's above terabytes. What's the next 1024 above terabytes? Petabytes? You can go to petabytes. But because you're booted from this master boot record partition table, it can't go past the 2.2 terabytes. And so that's great, really esoteric information, Tim. Why do I care about this? Because 3 terabytes is good, right? Because more is better. Well, the problem you get into is the Windows partition has to be completely within the first 2.2 terabytes. And so this, if you just go ahead and do what I said, it's like, oh, I went to that session at Penn State, and Tim said it has to be the last of the first 4, and we had that quiz, and I got 100% on the quiz. I'm going to go ahead and create it, EFI, Mac, recovery, and Windows. And this would go from, I don't know, halfway from the drive, from like 1.5 terabytes down to 3 terabytes. I got 1.5 terabytes of Windows space. I can go ahead and get on BitTorrent, download all this stuff. It's going to be great. Or maybe go into your Flickr account and download a terabyte worth of photos now. But the problem you get is if you're past this boundary. And this is one of the reasons when these 3 terabyte Macs first came out, you couldn't, you kind of wasted space. If you put it above that 2.2 terabyte line, you'd have 0.8 terabytes wasted. And I had many discussions with people that went from like a 500 gig hard drive to 3 terabytes. And I'd say, just get over it. It's 0.8 terabytes. And they're like, but it's 0.8 terabytes. You know how much space that is? And I say, okay, well, I feel for you. And this is the way 10.8.3 fixed it. So there was, I knew this had to happen because Apple was shipping these 3 terabyte Macs, and you would open up Disk Utility or Boot Camp Assistant. You'd open up Boot Camp Assistant, and it'd say that it's not supported on this Mac. And so Apple had a choice to go one of 2 ways, right? Are they going to dump? Because hard drives are only going to get bigger, right? Are they going to dump support for Boot Camp, or are they going to fix it in some way? And I suspected they were going to fix it because just because of the amount of switchers, right? Switching is a big thing, and being able to have Boot Camp, even though people don't use it, they get the warm, fuzzy feeling at the retail store, so they could do that, right? If this whole Mac thing's not going to work out, they can install Windows. Yeah.
I have one computer drive I got with an Apple system, and I couldn't go to the recovery project. I could do Camp,
right?
But it would never go to the recovery project.
That's weird.
Yeah, I mean, plug it was mine.
Okay.
Going back to Texas, but it was just reminded me.
So this is, that was a Fusion drive. So there's like 2 separate things here going on, right? There's the 3 terabyte drives and there's the 3 terabyte Fusion drive.
Right.
And there's similar issues. The one issue applies to both, and then there's an additional issue with the Fusion drive. We'll talk about that in a second. But then I suspected Apple's going to fix this. But people were saying it's going to go all EFI. 100% EFI because Windows 8 can boot EFI. Wouldn't the world be an awesome place if we could just all be EFI, sing Kumbaya, and go forward? And I suspected, you think, that keeps me up at night, right? Because that means Apple's going to drop support for basically everything before Windows 8. And would Apple do that? Yes, Apple would do that, right? But I suspected maybe they wouldn't. Because you want to support Windows 7 beforehand because it's about selling Macs, but I didn't know it's going to go. And that seems like a big jump to be able to do that. And so when it came out, and this is the solution, the way they ended up doing it 10.8.3, was I'd seen on the forums, people have been doing, and our forums have been doing this. What they do is they take core storage, they use core storage, right? Because core storage is an awesome ability to combine volumes together and make it look like one contiguous volume. It does a lot of other things as well, but that's one of the fundamental things it can do. And so you can take a core storage volume, physical volume. So this is the same one I had before, right? Everything's above this 2.2 terabyte line. And then you have these 2 things that you combine together to be one Mac volume. And then the Boot Camp partition is just its own partition off of this. I didn't recommend people do this, right? And the big reason is because you could not create, you couldn't add the core storage volume that you had. If you couldn't, you could create a core storage volume on your Mac without being destructive, but when you wanted to combine them together, you couldn't do that without paving and reinstalling. And so people were like, I don't like to recommend to people, like if you want your Boot Camp partition to get this extra 0.8 terabyte of space onto your Mac side, you have to go into the command line and combine core storage volumes, and you have to back up and restore all your Mac data. It just seemed really risky to me. So what I recommended people to do is just get over the 0.8, waste the 0.8 space, or format it as Mac HD, so you have 2 hard drives. And what Apple did is they came out and they said, you know what? We'll change our tools so we can non-destructively create this core storage volume. Have 2 different space and put them together. John, did you have something to add? Okay. He looked like he was, he had something to add into this. So really what we end up having is you have 2 things mounted on your desktop. This first one is 2 core storage volumes, and then you have the Macintosh hard drive. So that's the 3 terabyte without any Magic Fusion stuff associated with it. So now let's look what happens with Fusion. There's just one slight change to this. They take the core storage volume for the SSD and they put it into this core storage volume, logical volume for it. So it just expands your space. And what Fusion does is it knows which one's faster. So it moves files and blocks over to the one that's faster. So it's exactly the same thing. You just have a core storage volume with 3 things. First one is The main will be the main Macintosh hard drive. The one's after the 2.2 terabyte boundary, and the third one's the SSD. And then core storage does its magic to like figure out which one's the fastest. And then you have your boot camp partition hanging off here. What is this? Does anybody see what this tells you about speed? Which one's going to be faster? Mac side. Why? Well, it has the SSD, but why? It's Fusion knows to put the OS on that because it's going to be most likely to use files. Windows is going to be over here on the incredibly slow 5400 RPM drive, right? Which I've had people, it's like, no, I want to swap it. I want to have core storage, have my Windows bootable volume on the core storage. And my recommendation with them is good luck with that. Let me know when you figure it out, because you can't even boot a 10.7 machine to see a Fusion drive, or an earlier version. When was Fusion? It was 10.8 only? Yeah, I think it's 10.8 only. No, core storage was in 10.7. No, it was Fusion. The Fusion wasn't. Yeah, the Fusion wasn't supported. So one of the things that we are coming out with the next version of WinClone, let people aware of it. We want to do a real PC migration to be able to move from from a real PC over. The way Windows sets up, it's kind of interesting. Windows, if you install Windows from scratch, if you're installing a boot camp partition, it puts Windows on a single partition. It puts all the boot, BCD, all the boot stuff on that partition. If you install Windows natively, it actually creates this system restore partition that puts all the boot stuff on it. It's very small and it boots off, but very much similar to the way core storage works. So WinClone 4, we take care of that and put it all into one disk. And also it goes faster and does it over the network. And there's over 200% more awesome sauce included. So that's included. So that's kind of what the, we're running out of time. What's the future look like for dual booting, right? So now we talked about master boot records. We talked about Windows XP. That's kind of the past. So what's the future? Future is Google Glass. This is what we're all going to look like in the future. So we don't have to worry about dual booting anymore. It's all Windows. But in case that doesn't work out, there is UEFI. So UEFI has been rebranded to this Unified EFI. So it's now UEFI. And all this stuff that's been so painful is theoretical, and it has been in practice, goes away. So Windows PCs, I don't know if this is true, but I read it on the internet, so it probably is true, that PCs have been shipping with EFI for like 8 years, and it only turns on the master boot record compatibility, and so because Windows, they didn't want compatibility issues, so these machines have had EFI, but they weren't booting from it. Yep, you had a comment? Okay. Right, yes. Windows 8 is native EFI booting. If it supports it, it supports both. And we're starting to see machines ship with it. Yep. Oh, that's great. But once we're over this hump, right? Once we're in this nirvana of UEFI, we will have all this stuff that you don't have these issues. You don't have the 2.2 terabyte limit. You don't have a single version of Windows. You can hold down the Option key and you can have Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows Vista, whatever. I don't know. Windows Vista I don't think supports EFI. Everything in the future. Windows Blue. You'll see Windows Blue right there in your selection screen. External booting, which is a request I get almost daily for Windows. How do I take WinClone and put it on an external drive and boot from it? And I say, I got it to work, but it's not working anymore. And I say, well, that's what Reliable has to do. Apple doesn't support reliably booting from external drives. And right now it's really tricky to set up. If you go on the YouTubes, because any answer you want is on YouTube, Apple has a non-standard 1-point-something version of the EFI that's running on it. The Windows requires version 2.0 of EFI. We're not there yet, right? To get Windows to boot natively with EFI is not quite there yet, and you do have trouble with some tools as well. But it's really what's going to be, as EFI comes forward with Microsoft, kind of has the native booting standard, it's going to be there, but it'll probably be, well, XP is end of life in another year, and it's 11 years old, so it's probably going to be a while. All right, I don't have time for a demo. So references. So the Brigadier. It's on GitHub. Just Google it and you will find it. WinClone and Boot Runner, of course, are on our site. And Refit and Refined are on SourceForge. And I have 4 minutes left. And I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, so we've had some conversation. I could show a demo, but I don't want to run out of time. Yes, you got a comment?
Well, comment about the future. Something we're working on is just killing dual boot altogether and using AppV.
Using what?
AppV.
AppV?
Which is like the Windows virtualization.
Oh, okay.
So you log into your Mac, and you have an icon that says open your Windows environment, and it pulls up like a Citrix app.
Oh, okay. So it's a thin client, or if
Right,
it's okay.
Thin client, but the point is, no rebooting.
Right. So I didn't talk at all about the virtualization piece or the thin client, and that's very viable for a lot of environments because this session was just about dual boot labs. Right. But that is totally, we see a lot of people going into that, setting it up. The disadvantages to that is if it's in a lab, that's fine, but if it's something somebody takes outside and you have a VPN set up and make your Citrix available or whatever it is outside. So it's really environmentally dependent, right? But I didn't hear. What's the Windows one? Is not Hyper-V. It's what's the term? AppV. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that streaming apps? That's only to be able to run
AppV
apps?
streams apps, but those are Hyper-V, and it's
Okay.
also Microsoft sort of version of Citrix, but
Right.
we can use the Citrix viewer with it, so I think it's all using the same underlying.
Right. Mike?
Question. This past year, our Windows admins made the Windows image on Windows 7 like laptop or something where the two NDR was located on the secondary partition.
Yep.
So the only way that I was able to fix that, probably wasn't the best way, was to store it on the map, insert the disk, compare so that it's on the same position, and I recapture that again.
Right.
Bigger way to do that.
Yeah. So that's one of the things. I just recently worked on that in order to get that feature into WinClone to be able to combine them too, because I didn't want a separate partition because that would just be probably impossible. Probably involve blowing away the recovery partition, which is I don't want to do. So with this, when you have two separate partitions on Windows, you can combine them, and the way you do it is you move. And what the fixed one does, all it does is it moves the boot manager to the root level, and then it creates a boot folder. And inside the boot folder has that's where all the BCD stuff is. And the BCD is just it's a registry file, and then all the language localization. So those two files are moved over. And the big thing with that is that Windows 7, if boot manager's extended attribute for invisible isn't set, it won't boot. So WinClone will do that, but you can do, it's just a matter of moving those files in the right place and getting it to boot up. Windows 7 included boot manager on the boot partition, and Windows 8 doesn't. Oh no, on the standard partition. So there's a slight difference between Windows 7 and Windows 8, but as long as you have boot manager that's invisible at the root drive and the BCD folder, it'll work. Or just use WinClone 4.